The storm came without warning on the night of March 19, 1286. Along the rocky coast of Fife, where the Firth of Forth meets the North Sea, winds howled through the darkness with a fury that sent waves crashing against cliffs older than memory. At Edinburgh Castle, King Alexander III of Scotland had spent the day in council with his magnates, discussing matters of state that now seemed tragically mundane in retrospect. The king was 44 years old, vigorous and respected, ruler of a realm that had known unprecedented peace and prosperity under his 36-year reign. As evening descended, Alexander announced his intention to return to his new bride, Yolande de Dreux, who waited at Kinghorn Manor across the water. His counselors urged him to delay until morning. The storm was worsening. The ferry crossing would be treacherous. But Alexander III was a man accustomed to having his way, and perhaps something deeper drove him that night. A premonition, a urgency, a need to be with his young queen that overrode all caution and reason. The crossing was accomplished, though the ferryman later testified that waves nearly swamped the boat, and that the king himself seemed possessed by an unusual restlessness. At Inverkeithing, on the northern shore, Alexander's party remounted their horses. The route to Kinghorn followed cliff-top paths through darkness broken only by occasional flashes of lightning. Local guides were summoned, men who knew every stone and turning of the coastal road. They begged the king to seek shelter until dawn. Alexander refused. He spurred his horse forward into the teeth of the storm, his small escort struggling to keep pace. What happened in the hours that followed has been reconstructed from the testimony of those who found him, from the evidence written in mud and stone, from the silence of witnesses who were not there to see but could only imagine. Somewhere along that treacherous path on ground made treacherous by rain and darkness, the king's horse stumbled. Alexander III, King of Scots, descended from Malcolm Canmore and Margaret of Wessex, guardian of a kingdom stretching from the Solway to the Pentland Firth, fell. When dawn broke gray and cold over Kinghorn Bay, searchers discovered his body broken on rocks at the cliff base. His neck snapped. His reign ended in an instant of misjudgment and terrible fortune. The horse stood nearby, unharmed and confused, its reins tangled in gorse. The death sent shockwaves through Scotland and beyond. Alexander had been married twice. His first wife, Margaret of England, daughter of King Henry III and sister to Edward I, had borne him 3 children, all of whom predeceased their father. Prince Alexander died in 1284 at age 20. Prince David had died even younger in 1281. Princess Margaret, married to King Eric II of Norway, died in childbirth in 1283, leaving behind a single daughter. That child, Margaret, called the Maid of Norway, was Alexander III's sole surviving descendant. She was 3 years old living in Bergen, 1,000 miles across dangerous seas. Scotland had no other heir of the direct royal line. Alexander's second wife, Yolande, claimed she was pregnant, offering a desperate hope that perhaps the succession might yet be secured. But when her child was stillborn in November 1286, that hope died with it. The kingdom faced a crisis unprecedented in its history. For the first time in centuries, Scotland had no clear successor, no adult male heir, no figure around whom the realm could unite without question or division. At Scone Abbey on April 5, 1286, the magnates of Scotland assembled in emergency parliament. The great lords came from every corner of the realm. Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale, whose claim to royal blood traced through David Thurfer's youngest son, John Comyn of Badenoch, head of the most powerful noble family in Scotland, James the Steward, John Balliol of Galloway, William Fraser, Bishop of St. Andrews. They swore oaths to preserve the kingdom for the rightful heir, whoever that might prove to be. They elected 6 guardians, 3 bishops and 3 nobles, to govern Scotland during what they hoped would be a brief interregnum until the succession could be determined. The guardians swore to maintain peace, to enforce justice, to protect the realm against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But beneath the formal proceedings, tensions already simmered. Bruce and Balliol exchanged glances across the council chamber that spoke of ambitions barely restrained. Both men could claim descent from the royal house. Both commanded vast estates and military followings. Both believed themselves fitted for kingship should the Maid of Norway fail to survive the journey from Bergen, or should her claim be set aside in favor of proximity over primogeniture. As the magnates departed Scone, dispersing to their scattered domains, None could have imagined the catastrophe that awaited. The death of Alexander III had opened a chasm beneath Scottish sovereignty. Within 4 years, that chasm would swallow the kingdom's independence entire, plunging Scotland into wars that would rage for generations and reshape the political map of Britain forever. The storm that killed the king on those Fife cliffs was more than a tragedy of weather and misfortune. It was the first crack in a dam that had held for centuries, and when it finally broke, the deluge would be measured not in water, but in blood, betrayal, and the systematic destruction of Scotland's autonomy at the hands of an English king who saw opportunity where others saw only grief. The succession crisis had begun, though no one yet understood its true dimensions or the depths of treachery it would reveal. To comprehend the magnitude of what unfolded after Alexander III's death, one must first understand the political architecture of late 13th century Scotland and the complex web of dynastic relationships that bound and divided the kingdoms of Britain. Scotland had emerged from centuries of internal consolidation as a unified realm under a single crown, its borders largely stabilized, its institutions of governance increasingly sophisticated. The Scottish monarchy traced its legitimacy through an unbroken line, descending from the ancient kings of Alba, through Malcolm III, who had overthrown Macbeth in 1057, through David I, who had transformed Scotland into a feudal kingdom modeled on Norman England, through William the Lion, who had defended Scottish independence against Plantagenet aggression. This was not a peripheral or primitive realm, but a kingdom with its own parliament, its own legal traditions, its own sense of nationhood that predated the very concept as it would later be understood. Scotland minted its own coinage, maintained diplomatic relations across Europe, fielded armies that had held their own against English invasion, and possessed a cultural identity distinct from and occasionally antagonistic toward its southern neighbor. Yet Scotland's independence had always existed in tension with English ambitions. The relationship between the two kingdoms was defined by mutual suspicion, periodic warfare, and competing claims of overlordship that stretched back to Anglo-Saxon times. English kings had long asserted, with varying degrees of credibility and force, that Scotland owed fealty to England, that Scottish monarchs held their crowns as vassals of English suzerainty. These claims had been formalized in the Treaty of Falaise in 1174, when William the Lion, captured during an ill-advised invasion of Northumberland, swore homage to Henry II for Scotland and for all his other lands, and watched as English garrisons occupied Edinburgh, Berwick, Roxburgh, Jedburgh, and Stirling. For 15 years, Scotland existed as an acknowledged vassal kingdom, its sovereignty compromised, its king humiliated. Only Richard III's need for crusading funds prompted the quitclaim of Canterbury in 1189, which renounced English overlordship in exchange for 10,000 marks. Scottish kings thereafter performed homage to English monarchs for their English lands. Many Scottish nobles held estates south of the border, but fiercely resisted any suggestion that such homage extended to the Scottish crown itself. Alexander II and Alexander III had both navigated this delicate diplomatic terrain with skill, maintaining cordial relations with England while refusing any acknowledgement of subordinate status. The Treaty of York in 1237 had seemingly settled the border dispute between the kingdoms, establishing the line between Tweed and Solway that would endure for centuries. Alexander III's marriage to Margaret of England had further stabilized relations, creating familial bonds between the royal houses. When Alexander attended the coronation of his brother-in-law Edward I in 1274, he performed homage for his English lands with a carefully worded oath that excluded any mention of Scotland itself. Edward had pressed the issue, citing ancient precedents and demanding explicit recognition of English overlordship. Alexander's response, preserved in the chronicles, became a rallying cry for Scottish independence. "No one has the right to homage for my kingdom of Scotland save God alone, nor do I hold it save of God alone." Edward, still consolidating his own authority and distracted by Welsh wars, had let the matter drop. But the English king did not forget, and the precedents he claimed, however spurious or fabricated, remained recorded in documents that would be retrieved when opportunity presented itself. The death of Alexander III was that opportunity, and Edward I would exploit it with ruthless efficiency. The Scottish succession laws, as they existed in 1286, were not codified in any single document, but derived from custom, precedent, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. Primogeniture, succession through the eldest male line, had become increasingly dominant across feudal Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries, supplanting older Celtic traditions of tanistry, which favored proximity of blood and sometimes allowed collateral lines to succeed over more distant direct descendants. Scotland had largely accepted primogeniture, but the principle had never been tested in circumstances as extreme as those following Alexander's death. The king's granddaughter, Margaret, was female, a child and living in a foreign kingdom. Could she inherit? Scottish law permitted female succession in the absence of male heirs, but would the magnates accept a queen regnant who might never set foot in Scotland? Would they tolerate a regency that could last a decade or more? And what would happen if Margaret married? Would her husband become king? Would Scotland's independence survive a union with Norway or, as English diplomacy was already maneuvering to arrange, with England through marriage to Edward I's son? These questions had no clear answers in 1286, and the ambiguity created space for multiple claimants to emerge. The strongest claims derived from the three daughters of David, Earl of Huntingdon, younger brother of King William the Lion. David had died in 1230 without surviving male issue, but his daughters had married into powerful noble families, and by 1286, their descendants formed a constellation of potential heirs. Margaret, the eldest daughter, had married Alan, Lord of Galloway. Their daughter Dervergila married John Balliol, and their son, John Balliol, would emerge as the senior heir by strict primogeniture, being descended from the eldest female line. Isabella, the second daughter, had married Robert Bruce, 5th Lord of Annandale. He would argue that proximity, being one generation closer to David of Huntingdon, trumped primogeniture, and that the kingdom should not be treated as divisible property, but as an indivisible sovereignty that should pass to the nearest heir. Ada, the third daughter, had married Henry de Hastings. Their descendant, John Hastings, would argue that the kingdom should be partitioned equally among the co-heirs of the three sisters. Other claims would emerge from even more distant branches, including Floris Fed, Count of Holland, whose mother descended from Ada through a female line, and even King Eric of Norway, who half-heartedly pressed his claim through his late wife. The stage was set for a legal and political confrontation of unprecedented complexity, and into this chaos would step Edward I, not as an impartial arbitrator but as an opportunist, determined to subordinate Scotland to English authority once and for all. The tragedy that transformed a succession crisis into a constitutional catastrophe occurred on a gray September morning in 1290 in the windswept islands of Orkney. The child Queen Margaret, Maid of Norway, 7 years old and never crowned, died without ever reaching the kingdom she was meant to inherit. The circumstances of her death, documented in contemporary chronicles and confirmed by archaeological analysis of medieval Orkney's facilities, reveal a journey marked by misfortune from its inception. Margaret had departed Bergen in late August aboard a Norwegian vessel, accompanied by Bishop Narv of Bergen, who had served as her guardian since infancy, and a retinue of Norwegian attendants. The diplomatic arrangements surrounding her voyage had been extraordinarily complex. The Treaty of Bergen, negotiated in July 1290 between Scottish guardians and English envoys, had secured her betrothal to Edward of Caernarfon, heir to the English throne, while explicitly guaranteeing that Scotland would remain whole and separate, apart from the English kingdom. The marriage was intended to unite the crowns while preserving Scottish institutional independence, a delicate balance that satisfied neither Scottish nor English ambitions entirely, but represented the best compromise available under the circumstances. The voyage from Bergen to Scotland should have taken perhaps 2 weeks under favorable conditions, following established Norse sailing routes through the North Sea, but the autumn crossing was notoriously hazardous, and the ship carrying Margaret encountered storms that drove it off course. According to the testimony of Bishop Narve, recorded in Norwegian and Scottish sources, the child fell ill during the voyage, whether from seasickness, food poisoning from contaminated provisions, or some other malady remains uncertain. Modern medical historians have speculated about the possibilities, noting that the closed conditions aboard a medieval vessel, the poor quality of preserved food, and the stress of a long sea voyage could have triggered any number of fatal conditions in a child already weakened by the journey. The ship made emergency landfall at Orkney, then part of the Norwegian Crown's domain, seeking medical assistance that the remote islands could not adequately provide. Margaret lingered for perhaps a week, suffering in the arms of her guardian bishop, before death claimed her on September 26 or 27, 1290. The Scottish magnates, assembled at Scone Abbey awaiting her arrival for coronation, learned of her death in early October. The news struck like a thunderbolt, shattering the carefully constructed diplomatic settlement and opening the succession to all claimants. King Eric II of Norway, devastated by the loss of his only child, insisted that Margaret's body be returned to Bergen for burial. He demanded that the coffin be opened in his presence to confirm her identity, a request that speaks to either a father's need for closure or, more darkly, to suspicions that perhaps the child buried in Orkney was not his daughter, that some substitution had occurred. No evidence supports the latter theory, but the insistence on visual confirmation entered the historical record as a curious detail that later conspiracy theorists would seize upon. Margaret was buried in the north wall of the chancel of Christ Church in Bergen, a structure that has since been destroyed, taking with it any physical evidence that might resolve lingering questions about her death. In 1301, a German woman claiming to be Margaret appeared in Norway, proclaiming that she had survived and had been replaced by a corpse. This impostor, known to history as False Margaret, attracted a following before being exposed, tried, and burned at the stake. The incident reveals how desperately some clung to the hope that the succession crisis might be resolved through Margaret's miraculous survival, and how easily public credulity could be exploited in an age of limited communication and verification. Modern archaeological investigation of Orkney has provided context for Margaret's final days, though the specific location of her death remains uncertain. Excavations conducted at potential landing sites along the island's coasts have revealed the rudimentary nature of medieval port facilities. Stone jetties exposed to brutal weather, minimal shelter, no medical infrastructure beyond whatever folk remedies local populations possessed. For a 7-year-old child already weakened by prolonged seasickness, the conditions would have been desperate. Recent analysis of climate records for the late 13th century, reconstructed through ice cores and tree rings, confirms that 1290 was a particularly harsh year in the North Atlantic region, with unseasonably severe autumn storms that would have made the crossing from Norway exceptionally dangerous. Some researchers have questioned whether the voyage should have been attempted at all given the conditions, but political pressures, the need to secure the succession, the urgency of the English marriage negotiations, the approaching winter that would make later crossings impossible, overrode prudent caution. The decision cost Margaret her life and Scotland its last hope for a smooth succession. The Scottish guardians, upon learning of Margaret's death, faced an immediate crisis of legitimacy. Their authority derived from their role as stewards for the child queen. With her death, that mandate evaporated. The kingdom had no monarch, no agreed-upon heir, no institutional mechanism for determining succession among multiple claimants of roughly equal merit. Civil war loomed as a real possibility, with the Bruce and Balliol factions already positioning their supporters for potential conflict. Appeals were sent to Pope Celestine IV, requesting papal mediation, but the elderly pontiff's brief and chaotic reign, he would abdicate within months, offered no practical assistance. In this desperate situation, the guardians made the fateful decision to invite Edward I of England to arbitrate the competing claims. The invitation was framed as a request for Edward to serve as a neutral judge, chosen for his learning in law, his experience in governance, and his familial connection to Scotland through his late sister Margaret. What the guardians sought was arbitration, a judicial decision by a respected authority that would be accepted by all parties and prevent civil war. What Edward I intended to provide was something altogether different, a judgment that would subordinate Scotland to English overlordship and destroy the independence that Scottish kings had defended for centuries. The invitation to Edward was the hinge upon which Scotland's fate would turn, and historians have debated ever since whether the guardians could have avoided it, whether any alternative existed that might have preserved both peace and sovereignty. The discovery of Margaret's death in Orkney did not merely create a succession crisis. It created the conditions under which Edward II could execute a plan he had likely been contemplating since his brother-in-law's death in 1286, the plan to reduce Scotland to the status of an English province, using legal process as the weapon that military conquest had failed to provide. The proceedings that unfolded between May 1291 and November 1292 known to contemporaries as the Great Cause, and to later historians as the most consequential judicial process in Scottish history, began at Norham Castle on the English side of the border. Edward the Fern arrived there on May 10, 1291, accompanied by an impressive entourage of lawyers, clerks, and armed forces that made clear this was no simple mediation. The Scottish representatives, the guardians, the bishops, and representatives of the 9 principal claimants to the throne, crossed the Tweed expecting discussions about arbitration procedures. What Edward presented instead was a demand that shocked and divided them. Before he would agree to hear any claims, before any judicial process could begin, all parties must formally recognize him as Lord Paramount of Scotland, as feudal overlord possessing ultimate authority over the Scottish crown. This was not a request for acknowledgement of his role as arbitrator. This was a demand for submission, for recognition of English suzerainty, for acceptance of the very principle that Scottish kings from William the Lion to Alexander III had resisted throughout their reigns. The demand was backed by an English army encamped within sight of Norham, a force that made clear refusal would have consequences. The Scottish representatives requested 3 weeks to consider Edward's demand, a delay he granted with apparent magnanimity. Behind closed doors, the guardians and Scottish magnates debated their options with increasing desperation. To refuse Edward's demand would mean facing the English army without a legitimate king to rally around, with the kingdom already divided among competing claimants. To accept the demand would be to concede the very independence Scotland had fought to preserve. The legal reasoning offered by Edward's clerk cited precedents stretching back to Anglo-Saxon times, homages allegedly performed by Scottish kings to English overlords, instances where Scottish rulers had acknowledged subordinate status. Scottish representatives countered that these precedents were either fabrications, misinterpretations of homage performed for English lands rather than the Scottish crown, or coerced acknowledgments made under duress that had subsequently been renounced. The debate over historical precedent consumed days of argumentation, with Edward's lawyers producing documents whose authenticity and interpretation remain contested by scholars to this day. Some historians believe certain of Edward's cited documents were outright forgeries, created or modified to support claims that had no genuine historical basis. The sophistication of medieval record-keeping makes definitive determination impossible, but patterns of suspicious editing, anachronistic language, and conveniently missing counter-documents suggest systematic manipulation of the historical record to serve Edward's purposes. By early June 1291, facing the reality of English military superiority and the alternative of civil war among claimants who could not agree on arbitration procedures, the principal competitors, Balliol, Bruce, and the others, individually submitted to Edward as Lord Paramount. Their submissions, preserved in multiple manuscript copies, carefully avoided acknowledging that they spoke for the Scottish nation as a whole. This was a critical distinction that Edward sought to blur, but that the Scottish representatives attempted to maintain. The claimants could acknowledge Edward's authority over them personally in order to gain access to his judgment, but this did not constitute acceptance of English overlordship by Scotland itself. The distinction would prove meaningless in practice, as Edward promptly demanded, and received, surrender of Scotland's principal royal castles: Edinburgh, Stirling, Roxburgh, Berwick. The castles were to be held by Edward during the proceedings and returned to the successful claimant within 2 months of judgment. In practice, English constables were installed in these fortifications, and Edward began issuing orders throughout Scotland as if he were already its sovereign. He toured the kingdom during July and August, receiving homages from Scottish nobles who understood that cooperation was prudent given the military reality. The legal process that was supposed to determine Scotland's next king had become, before it properly began, an instrument of English conquest by judicial means. The court assembled at Berwick-upon-Tweed in August 1291, relocating from Norham to what was then Scotland's largest and wealthiest burgh. The judicial body consisted of 104 auditors, assessors who would examine evidence and render judgment. Edward himself selected 24 auditors from senior members of the Scottish political community, men whose loyalty to Scotland was presumably beyond question, but who now found themselves serving at Edward's pleasure. The 2 principal claimants, Balliol and Bruce, were each permitted to appoint 40 auditors, creating a body evenly divided between their supporters. The structure appeared balanced, designed to prevent either faction from dominating the outcome. In practice, the composition ensured that Edward, as president of the court and arbiter of disputed questions of law and procedure, would control the process entirely. The auditors were presented with genealogical evidence, copies of charters documenting the descent of each claimant from royal ancestors, legal arguments about inheritance principles, and historical precedents for how disputed successions had been resolved in other kingdoms. The hearings stretched across 15 months, interrupted by adjournments for Christmas and other occasions, conducted in Latin with translations into French and Scots for those who required them. Witnesses testified about family connections, about marriages and births decades in the past, about customs of inheritance in Scottish and English law. The proceedings generated thousands of pages of documentation, much of which survives in English and Scottish archives, providing modern historians with an unprecedented window into medieval legal reasoning and political maneuvering. 3 main claims emerged as serious contenders, though 13 competitors formally presented cases. John Balliol argued that the principle of primogeniture must govern, that the kingdom, like any other heritable property, should pass to the senior heir regardless of the number of generations intervening. His mother, Dervorgilla, had been the daughter of Margaret, eldest daughter of David of Huntingdon. He was therefore the representative of the senior female line, though separated from David by 3 generations. Robert Bruce the Elder argued that proximity of blood must take precedence, that the kingdom was not mere property, but an indivisible sovereignty that should pass to the nearest heir. He was the son of Isabella, second daughter of David of Huntingdon, making him 1 generation closer to the common royal ancestor. Bruce invoked Celtic traditions of tanistry, arguing that Scottish custom had historically favored nearness over seniority when the succession was disputed. John Hastings proposed a radical solution, that the kingdom be divided equally among the co-heirs of David of Huntingdon's 3 daughters, treating Scotland as partible inheritance. His claim, while legally coherent under certain interpretations of feudal property law, was politically untenable and seemed designed more to establish negotiating leverage than to secure actual victory. The auditors, in their deliberations, considered English precedents, Norman law, canon law, and Scottish custom, seeking principles that might resolve the competing claims. The decision, when it finally came in November 1292, favored Balliol's case. Primogeniture, the court ruled, must govern the succession. The kingdom was indivisible, and must therefore pass intact to the senior heir by strict genealogical priority. The judgment was legally sound by contemporary standards, and most modern historians agree that Balliol's claim was indeed the strongest under accepted principles of feudal inheritance. But the circumstances under which the judgment was rendered, with Edward presiding as acknowledged overlord, with English garrisons occupying Scottish castles, with the alternative being continued English occupation or civil war, raised questions about its legitimacy that would haunt the coming decades and provide justification for those who would later resist. John Balliol was inaugurated as King of Scots at Scone Abbey on November 30th, 1292, seated upon the Stone of Destiny as Scottish kings had been for centuries. But within weeks, Edward was asserting his overlordship with unprecedented aggressiveness, demanding that Balliol answer appeals from Scottish court decisions before English tribunals, stripping away the judicial independence that the Treaty of Berghem had supposedly guaranteed, making clear that the new King of Scots was to be a puppet, whose strings Edward intended to control completely. Modern scholars attempting to reconstruct the precise sequence of events during the Great Cause encounter a frustrating reality. The documentary record, while extensive in some areas, contains systematic gaps that suggest deliberate suppression of inconvenient evidence. The proceedings at Berwick generated enormous quantities of documentation, genealogical proofs, legal arguments, testimony transcripts, procedural records detailing each session's deliberations. Yet when researchers examine the surviving archives, they find curious absences. Certain crucial documents exist only in partial form, with pages missing from bound volumes at points where the content should address the most controversial questions. The Scottish response to Edward's demand for recognition as overlord, for instance, survives only in fragmentary form. The Guardian's formal reply, presented in June 1291, argued that without a king, no one possessed authority to make such an acknowledgement on Scotland's behalf. This was a technically correct legal position, grounded in contemporary understanding of sovereignty and representation. Yet Edward ordered that this response not be entered into the official record of proceedings. The exclusion is noted in surviving procedural documents, references to the Scottish reply which was deemed inadmissible, but the full text of what the Scots argued has never been found in any English archive. Some historians believe copies may survive in Scottish repositories, but systematic searches have failed to locate them. The pattern of documentary suppression extends to multiple areas of the proceedings. Records from the early June 1291 negotiations, when Edward presented his claim of overlordship and the Scots disputed his historical precedents, are remarkably sparse considering the importance of these discussions. We know from later references that extensive debate occurred, that Scottish representatives challenged the authenticity and interpretation of documents Edward's clerks produced, that counter-precedents were offered demonstrating Scotland's historic independence. Yet the official records preserved in English archives contain only summary notes, legal conclusions without the supporting argumentation. This is unusual for medieval judicial proceedings of such magnitude. Courts of the period typically maintained detailed records precisely to establish precedent and demonstrate procedural correctness. The absence of such detail in precisely the areas where Scottish resistance was strongest suggests that materials were removed from the archives, either during the proceedings themselves or in subsequent decades when English governments sought to suppress evidence of Scotland's legitimate arguments for independence. Archives in Edinburgh and other Scottish repositories show corresponding gaps. Monastic cartularies from abbeys with known connections to the royal court contain folios that have been physically removed, cut pages whose stubs remain visible in the bindings. The missing sections correspond to the years 1290–1296, precisely the period of the succession crisis and its immediate aftermath. Forensic examination of surviving documents reveals another layer of manipulation: erasures, overwriting, and marginal annotations that suggest systematic editing of the historical record. In several manuscripts containing references to the Great Cause, passages have been scraped away using pumice or blades, the parchment then reused for alternative text. Multispectral imaging technology, applied to these palimpsests by researchers at Scottish and English universities, has recovered portions of the erased text. What emerges are references to unlawful demands, to coerced submissions, to Scottish objections that were apparently deemed too inflammatory to preserve in their original form. One particularly revealing erasure, recovered from a manuscript held in the British Library, contains a marginal note stating that the Scots submitted under protest, maintaining that their acknowledgement was void for duress and without authority. This notation was obliterated and replaced with standard legal formula about willing submission, but the original text survived beneath the surface scraping, invisible to the naked eye, but recoverable through modern technology. The pattern suggests a coordinated effort, possibly in the 14th century but perhaps extending into later periods, to remove from the historical record any evidence that might support Scottish claims of illegitimate English overlordship. The most significant documentary mystery concerns the fate of materials that contemporaries mention, but that no longer exist. Multiple chroniclers reference formal Scottish protests lodged with Pope Celestine V and his successor Boniface VIII, appealing the proceedings at Berwick and requesting papal intervention to protect Scottish sovereignty. These protests would have been transmitted through formal diplomatic channels, with copies retained by Scottish ecclesiastical authorities. Yet neither the Vatican archives nor Scottish repositories contain any trace of them. Either they were lost in the normal attrition that affects medieval documents, or they were deliberately destroyed by parties who found their contents inconvenient. Similarly, records mention that King Eric of Norway lodged a formal claim to the Scottish throne on behalf of his deceased daughter, arguing that as Margaret's father and former regent, he possessed rights that superseded those of collateral heirs. Eric's claim was dismissed, apparently without serious consideration, and the documentation supporting his case has never been located. This is particularly puzzling because Norwegian royal archives are extensive and well preserved for this period, suggesting that materials related to Eric's Scottish claim may have been deliberately removed from Norwegian collections, possibly by representatives of Edward I, who would have had strong motivation to suppress evidence of alternative claims that might complicate his efforts to control the Scottish succession. Parliamentary records from the first years of John Balliol's reign show similar gaps. Balliol's government convened parliaments and councils, issued charters, conducted diplomatic correspondence, maintained the apparatus of royal administration. Yet the survival rate of documents from 1292-1296 is dramatically lower than from the decades immediately before and after. This cannot be explained by normal archival attrition, which tends to be relatively consistent across time periods. The targeted nature of the losses, concentrated in the years when Balliol was attempting to assert independence from English overlordship, suggests that documents were systematically destroyed, probably during or immediately after Edward I's conquest of Scotland in 1296. When English forces occupied Edinburgh Castle and other Scottish strongholds, they would have had access to royal archives. Evidence from later periods confirms that Edward ordered the seizure of Scottish state papers, including items that might support Scottish claims to independence or document Edward's heavy-handed interference in Scottish governance. The Ragman Rolls, lists of Scottish nobles who swore allegiance to Edward in 1296, survive because they served English administrative purposes. Documents that might have challenged the legitimacy of that subjugation were apparently destroyed. The pattern of destruction and suppression means that historians attempting to reconstruct Scottish resistance to Edward's demands during the Great Cause must rely heavily on English sources, which naturally present events from the perspective of English legal and political priorities. Scottish voices are largely silenced in the surviving record, preserved only in fragments and marginal notes, in erasures that reveal themselves centuries later to technologies their creators could never have imagined. The reconstruction of the Great Cause requires comparing accounts from multiple kingdoms, each preserving different aspects of events depending on their political interests and documentary practices. English sources, naturally the most extensive, present the proceedings as a triumph of legal rationality and Edward's legitimate authority. Chronicles written by English ecclesiastics and royal clerks emphasize the disorder in Scotland following Margaret's death, the inability of Scottish leaders to resolve the succession without external assistance, and Edward's magnanimous agreement to arbitrate despite the burdens it imposed on his governance. The Flores Historiarum, compiled at Westminster Abbey, describes Edward as performing his duty as overlord with patience and wisdom, hearing all claimants fairly, applying principles of law without favor. This narrative served English propaganda purposes, justifying Edward's subsequent interventions in Scotland as the rightful actions of a sovereign dealing with rebellious vassals. Yet even these English sources contain anomalies that undermine their surface narrative. References to Scottish objections appear in marginal notes and subordinate clauses, hints that the proceedings were more contentious than the official record suggests. Scottish chronicles present a dramatically different picture, though fewer survive and many were written decades after the events they describe. John of Fordun, writing in the 1370s, characterized the Great Cause as a betrayal, describing how Edward manipulated desperate Scottish nobles into acknowledging overlordship they had no authority to grant. Fordun preserves traditions of Scottish resistance that appear nowhere in English sources, accounts of nobles who refused to submit, of protests lodged with ecclesiastical authorities, of covert communications among Scottish leaders discussing how to resist Edward's encroachments while avoiding open conflict they could not win. The Scotichronicon, an expansion of Fordun's work compiled by Walter Bower in the 1440s, adds further details about Scottish opposition, though the temporal distance from events makes distinguishing authentic tradition from later patriotic embellishment difficult. What is clear from Scottish sources is that the proceedings were never viewed as legitimate arbitration, but as coerced submission disguised in legal formality. The competing narratives preserve fundamentally incompatible memories of the same events. English sources recording willing submission to recognized authority, Scottish sources recording capitulation under military threat to claims of overlordship that violated established sovereignty. Continental sources provide a third perspective, valuable precisely because their authors had no direct stake in Anglo-Scottish disputes. French chronicles, particularly those associated with the royal court, show keen interest in Scottish affairs due to emerging alliance between Scotland and France against common English threats. The Grande Chronique de France, compiled at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, preserves accounts of diplomatic missions between Scottish leaders and King Philip IV, suggesting that Scotland was actively seeking French support even during the proceedings at Berwick. These missions, unremarked in English sources and only obliquely referenced in Scottish chronicles, indicate that Scottish leaders never fully trusted Edward's arbitration and were preparing alternative strategies should the process fail to preserve their independence. The continental perspective is particularly valuable in assessing Edward I's manipulation of legal procedures. French jurists, examining the case from a distance, noted that Edward's demand for recognition as overlord before hearing claims violated established principles of arbitration, which required the arbitrator to be impartial rather than a party with vested interest in the outcome. That Edward managed to impose this requirement despite its obvious impropriety demonstrated, in the French view, the weakness of Scottish political organization and the dangers of inviting a powerful neighbor to resolve internal disputes. Norwegian sources add another dimension, preserving King Eric II's perspective on the succession crisis that cost him his only child. The Icelandic annals and Norwegian chronicle material document Eric's bitter resentment at how Margaret's death was handled, his suspicions that perhaps the child's illness had not been entirely natural, and his half-hearted claim to the Scottish throne that was dismissed by the proceedings at Berwick. Eric's position was legally weak but emotionally compelling. He had lost his daughter to a diplomatic marriage he had reluctantly accepted, and her death left him with no living heirs, and no compensation for his loss. Norwegian sources suggest that Eric briefly considered military intervention in Scotland, leveraging Norway's control of the Western Isles and Orkney to establish a power base, but abandoned the plan when it became clear Scottish nobles would not support such a venture. The Norwegian documentation of Eric's claim, while sparse, confirms that alternatives to the Balliol-Bruce dichotomy existed, that the succession was genuinely open to multiple interpretations, and that Edward's control of the proceedings ensured certain possibilities were never seriously considered. Papal archives preserve yet another perspective, one that combines ecclesiastical authority with diplomatic caution. Pope Boniface VIII, who succeeded the short-lived Celestine V in 1294, inherited a difficult situation regarding Scotland. Scottish appeals for papal intervention in the succession dispute had been largely ignored by Celestine during his brief reign, but Boniface received renewed requests from Scottish clergy who argued that Edward I had usurped papal authority over religious matters and violated the independence of the Scottish Church. The papal registers contain correspondence with Scottish bishops, with Edward I, and with French authorities, attempting to navigate between competing claims without directly confronting the powerful English king. What emerges from papal documentation is evidence that ecclesiastical authorities recognized the problematic nature of Edward's overlordship claim, but felt constrained by political realities from challenging it forcefully. Boniface eventually issued the bull Simus Filii in 1299, asserting papal supremacy over Scotland and denying English claims of overlordship, but by then the damage was done, and Scotland was already engaged in the wars of independence that would consume the next generation. Comparing these divergent sources reveals that no single narrative captures the full complexity of the great cause. English sources emphasize legal process while minimizing coercion. Scottish sources emphasize English aggression, while perhaps underplaying internal Scottish divisions that made resistance difficult. Continental sources provide external validation of Scottish complaints while revealing Scotland's diplomatic isolation. Papal sources document ecclesiastical concerns while demonstrating the limits of spiritual authority when confronted with military power. Together, these fragmentary accounts allow reconstruction of events that none fully captures alone. A succession crisis that began as a genuine legal dispute and ended as justification for conquest. A judicial process that violated the very principles of impartiality it claimed to embody. A moment when Scotland's independence hung in the balance and was tipped toward subjugation by a combination of internal weakness, external pressure, and one king's ruthless exploitation of legal formality to achieve political domination that military force alone had never secured. The true nature of Edward I's intervention in Scottish succession becomes clearer when examining documents that survived by accident rather than official preservation, private correspondence, financial records, and intelligence reports that reveal planning. Edward began long before Margaret's death made intervention possible. Records from the English royal chancery show that as early as 1286, immediately following Alexander III's death, Edward's ministers were already researching precedents for English overlordship of Scotland. The research was systematic, involving consultation of chronicles in monasteries across England, examination of charters from previous reigns, and, most tellingly, compilation of historical claims that modern scholars recognize as dubious or fabricated. The research dossier, portions of which survive in the National Archives at Kew, includes documents purporting to show that Scottish kings had performed homage to English overlords since Anglo-Saxon times, that Scotland had been conquered by English arms during various periods, that English monarchs had historically possessed the right to intervene in Scottish succession disputes. Some of these claims had kernels of historical truth. William the Lion had indeed sworn homage after capture in 1174, but the dossier systematically misrepresented the contexts, durations, and subsequent repudiations of these submissions. Most revealing are documents that appear to be deliberately fabricated or significantly altered to support English claims. A charter purporting to show that Malcolm IV acknowledged David the Furer as having held Scotland from Henry II of England contains paleographic features inconsistent with 12th century documents. The parchment quality, the handwriting style, and the vocabulary used suggest production in the late 13th century, almost certainly during Edward the Hru's reign, when such evidence would have been needed for the Great Cause proceedings. Multiple medieval historians and modern paleographers have examined this and similar documents, concluding that Edward's chancery engaged in what amounts to documentary fraud, creating or altering historical records to manufacture precedents where none existed. The sophistication of the forgeries indicates this was not casual falsification, but carefully planned deception, employing skilled scribes familiar with archaic writing styles and able to produce documents that would pass casual examination by contemporary audiences unfamiliar with detailed paleographic analysis. That Edward went to such lengths to establish documentary basis for his overlordship claim suggests he understood that military conquest alone would not provide lasting control over Scotland, that legitimacy required legal justification, and that manufacturing such justification was worth significant effort and expense. The network of intelligence gathering Edward employed during the succession crisis reveals another dimension of his manipulation. Financial records preserved in the English Exchequer accounts document payments to Scottish nobles, clerics, and merchants who provided information about internal Scottish politics, factional alignments, and potential resistance to English demands. These payments, disguised as travel expenses or compensation for services, flowed to individuals across Scotland, creating an intelligence network that kept Edward informed of Scottish intentions throughout the proceedings. One particularly significant recipient was an unnamed cleric described in accounts as "our faithful servant in Scotland who provides information about the deliberations of the guardians." The sums paid, substantial by medieval standards, indicate this was valuable intelligence, likely including details of private Scottish discussions about how to resist Edward's overlordship claim while still securing his arbitration. Armed with such intelligence, Edward could anticipate Scottish objections, prepare counter-arguments, and time his demands to exploit moments of Scottish weakness or division. The systematic suppression of alternative claims to the Scottish throne represents another dimension of conspiracy. While historical attention has focused on the Balliol-Bruce competition, other claimants presented cases that raised uncomfortable questions about the basis of succession and the role Edward claimed for himself. Patrick Gallathly, whose claim derived from an illegitimate line, argued that Scottish succession should not be restricted to legitimate descendants if no clear heir existed among them. His argument, preserved only in fragmentary form, suggested that the kingdom's stability and the character of potential rulers should matter more than strict genealogical priority. This was a dangerous argument from Edward's perspective, because it opened discussion of whether the succession process should consider what was best for Scotland, rather than merely applying inheritance law mechanically. Gallathly's claim was dismissed early in proceedings, but the speed and finality of the dismissal suggests Edward wanted to foreclose any discussion that might lead to consideration of Scotland's interests as distinct from legal formality. Similarly, the claim of Floris Feuve, Count of Holland, was twice dismissed despite his request for additional time to produce evidence. Floris claimed inability to produce necessary documents due to theft, a suspiciously convenient explanation, but one that raises the possibility that Edward's agents actively worked to prevent alternative claimants from mounting effective cases. The broader pattern suggests that Edward approached the Great Cause not as genuine arbitration, but as theater designed to legitimize predetermined outcomes. The structure of the proceedings, with Edward controlling the appointment of a quarter of the auditors, with English garrisons occupying Scottish castles, with English law and precedent dominating the legal framework applied, ensured that no judgment could issue that conflicted with English interests. That Balliol ultimately received the crown despite Edward's preference suggests the case in his favor was too strong to overturn without completely destroying the process's credibility. But Edward ensured that Balliol would reign as his vassal, that Scottish independence would be compromised regardless of who won, that the proceedings themselves would establish precedents for English interference that could be invoked in future disputes. This was statecraft of the highest or lowest order, using law as an instrument of conquest more effective than military force, establishing subjugation through judicial process that would be harder to resist than occupation achieved through open warfare. The conspiracy was not hidden in shadows but conducted in full view, disguised as justice, presented as service to Scottish interests, and preserved in official records that omitted or obscured every moment of coercion and manipulation that made it possible. The consequences of the great cause rippled outward from Berwick in waves that would reshape British politics for centuries. John Balliol's inauguration at Scone Abbey on November 30, 1292, should have marked the end of the succession crisis and the restoration of stable monarchy in Scotland. Instead, it marked the beginning of a different crisis, the systematic destruction of Scottish independence under Edward III's overlordship. Within weeks of his coronation, Balliol found himself summoned to English courts to answer appeals from Scottish legal decisions, stripped of the judicial authority that defined medieval kingship. In December 1292, barely a month after becoming king, Balliol was required to perform homage to Edward at Newcastle, acknowledging himself as Edward's vassal. The ceremony, described in both English and Scottish chronicles, was deliberately humiliating. Edward had Balliol sign a document releasing Edward from every promise made in the Treaty of Berghem, every protection that was supposed to preserve Scottish autonomy. The document, preserved in English archives, makes clear that Edward intended to treat Scotland as conquered territory, regardless of the legal fictions of arbitration and peaceful succession. Through 1293 and 1294, Edward systematically undermined Balliol's authority. Scottish nobles appealed to English courts over Balliol's head, encouraged by Edward's willingness to overturn Scottish judgments and summon the Scottish king himself to appear as a defendant before English tribunals. When Balliol attempted to assert his independence by delaying or refusing Edward's demands, he was threatened with confiscation of his kingdom. The pressure broke Scottish political consensus. Many nobles, led by the common family who had supported Balliol's claim during the Great Cause, urged the king to resist Edward's encroachments. Others, including ironically the Bruce faction who had lost the succession dispute, counseled accommodation. The divisions that had been temporarily suppressed during the arbitration process re-emerged with devastating effect. By 1295, faced with Edward's demand for military service in his war against France, Balliol and the Scottish magnates made the decision that would define Scottish policy for the next 3 centuries. They concluded an alliance with France, the treaty that would become known as the Auld Alliance. The pact was both defensive alliance and declaration of independence, a statement that Scotland would resist English overlordship by allying with England's greatest enemy. Edward I's response was overwhelming force. In March 1296, English armies crossed the border and sacked Berwick-upon-Tweed, Scotland's largest and wealthiest town. Contemporary accounts describe massacre so complete that chroniclers claimed blood ran in the streets for 3 days. That 17,000 died, though modern historians regard this as likely exaggeration. The psychological impact was immense. Berwick had been a symbol of Scottish commercial prosperity, and its destruction demonstrated that Edward would show no mercy to Scottish resistance. Scottish forces attempted to fight back, but were crushed at the Battle of Dunbar in April 1296. The victory gave Edward control of southern Scotland and access to the heart of the kingdom. John Balliol, abandoned by nobles who made their own accommodations with English power, formally surrendered his kingdom in July 1296 at Montrose. The ceremony of abdication was designed to humiliate. Balliol was forced to remove his royal insignia publicly, his coat of arms torn from his surcoat in a ritual stripping of royal dignity that earned him the derisive nickname Tomb Tabard, empty coat. He was taken to England as prisoner, where he would spend the rest of his life in comfortable but permanent exile. A king without a kingdom, his brief reign remembered as failure. The conquest extended to symbols as well as territory. In August 1296, Edward ordered removal of the Stone of Destiny from Scone Abbey. The stone, an ancient symbol of Scottish kingship used in coronation since time immemorial, was transported to Westminster Abbey and incorporated into a special throne Edward commissioned. The coronation chair, built in 1300-1301 to house the captured stone, was designed to make literal the English claim that future kings of England would also reign as kings of Scotland. The stone seizure was more than trophy-taking. It was an attempt to destroy the legitimacy of any future Scottish coronation conducted without it. Along with the stone, Edward seized Scottish state papers, the royal seal, and portions of the Scottish crown jewels, attempting to erase the administrative and symbolic infrastructure of Scottish independence. His goal was not merely military conquest but the obliteration of Scotland as a distinct political entity, its absorption into an expanded English kingdom under permanent English control. The systematic nature of this cultural destruction suggests that Edward understood kingship was not merely about controlling territory, but about controlling the narratives, symbols, and institutions that gave sovereignty its meaning and legitimacy. Yet resistance emerged almost immediately. Within a year of Balliol's abdication, William Wallace had raised rebellion in southern Scotland, winning a stunning victory over English forces at Stirling Bridge in September 1297. Wallace's resistance, though ultimately unsuccessful when he was captured and executed in 1305, demonstrated that Edward's conquest had not extinguished Scottish identity or willingness to fight for independence. Wallace's legacy was inherited by Robert Bruce, grandson of the original claimant, who launched his own rebellion in 1306 and was crowned King of Scots at Scone, despite the absence of the Stone of Destiny. Bruce's ultimately successful resistance, culminating in victory at Bannockburn in 1314 and the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, reversed much of Edward's conquest. But the damage done during the Great Cause and its aftermath could not be fully undone. The precedent of English interference in Scottish affairs had been established. The documents Edward's chancery created asserting overlordship remained in English archives, ready to be invoked by future English kings pursuing the same goal of Scottish subordination. The wars of Scottish independence would rage intermittently until the Treaty of Edinburgh in 1328 finally forced English recognition of Scottish sovereignty, but even that recognition would prove temporary when later English monarchs revived Edward I's claims. The Great Cause had created a wound in Anglo-Scottish relations that would fester for centuries, its effects visible in every subsequent conflict between the kingdoms, in the religious wars of the Reformation, in the civil wars of the 17th century, even in modern debates about Scottish independence. What began as a succession dispute in 1290 became a template for how powerful states could use legal process as an instrument of conquest, how sovereignty could be subverted through apparently legitimate procedures, and how the murder of independence could be accomplished not on battlefields but in courtrooms under the guise of justice and law.